Pew, 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 pew. Aloha. Welcome to Season 2, Episode 6 of the Awakening Audiobiography with Martita from Light Diamond Creative on Instagram, but not on Facebook because I deactivated it. And also I am on YouTube, as you have found here. You're probably listening to this through YouTube right now. And Light Diamond Creative is also on Venmo and Cash App for branding and donation purposes to support the continuance of free content. Oh my goodness. If this is your first time listening, welcome. And I recommend going back all the way to the beginning, because there is a lot that we are covering in these podcasts. Season 1 was a podcast based around meditation, the science of meditation, perspectives of the 9-chakra system from the Tibetan Buddhist practice, and interpretations of the practice, as well as a few meditations that are simply available for you to listen to and meditate on YouTube for free. And here in Season 2, we're shifting a little bit, although the meditation and the topic of this season are very related. Again, this season is called the Awakening Audiobiography, and we've journeyed through already some of the main experiences that I have had as an awakening person on Earth right now. And the purpose for sharing this information is really to hopefully resonate with you all if you have experienced similar steps as I have, and also to give information to those who are in some of the earlier stages of the awakening process. So hopefully this information you find either entertaining or informative or enlightening or whatever. If you have found this, then it has also found you. So thanks for being here. Today in episode 6, we're picking up where we left off. And let me say this too, that I am sharing it for others, and it also serves me to be able to talk about these topics. There's no denying that. And these next few episodes are probably going to be a really big healing experience for me, because a lot of what we will be getting into is stuff I haven't shared with people before, because as I was going through these steps, I didn't feel like I could talk to people about it. And part of that is because of the intensity of the topics, and part of that is also because at the time of these occurrences, I was pretty blocked in terms of throat chakra and communication and authentic self-expression via the voice. So here I am years later recapping the instances, and it's probably better that it's been some years, because I've been able to not be as in the trenches in regards to these particular situations, although, sometimes I do definitely still feel in the trenches when it comes to the awakening steps that I am currently in, and that's okay. In any case, what we have covered so far in this season is really starting with how I grew up and the spiritual and religious influences, and then getting into college experiences and college life and learning, moving on into post-college when I just could not take the structure anymore, and it was really hyper-structured. So, and just a side note, the hyperstructure is really a reflection of the intense amount of imbalanced masculine energy manifested in the societal norm of overstructure. In any case, we talked about some of that, and then we got into a move to Florida that changed my life. So here we are. If you're not caught up, again, I highly recommend going to check out those earlier episodes and podcast season 2, and even going all the way back to the beginning with season 1. You know, the way this information is getting delivered is chronological and based on the general image of the puzzle that I am attempting to create with my words. So you would benefit from going back to the beginning. In any case, if you're here and you just want to listen to this, welcome. This episode, we are focusing on the awakening aspect that is becoming aware of substance abuse. Awakening, what I have talked about, this process, this term, awakening, is pretty broad and lifelong, I think. And it, to me, means coming to grip with reality, coming to grips with truth, and truly observing and receiving information from the environment around us, as well as going through the internal space, mostly going through the internal space to clear out, declutter the internal energy, to reorganize, to make some serious internal energetic shifts. And for me, the motivation in doing that has largely been in I really care about the environment and the world around me. And so if I cannot go out and with control alter the things that I think need to be controlled, instead, what I can do is observe what I wish to change that is external and identify that similar frequency that exists within myself and go in to myself to untangle that energetic knot so that if the quantum physics is true, as I untangle these energetic knots within myself, then that shows a reflection in the external, reflecting the changes that I've made within and showing me a renewed world. This major stuff that we're talking about. But this episode is specifically talking about substance abuse awakening and specifically talking about addiction and drugs. For myself, I did not experience drugs until much later in my life than many people do. I did experience alcohol getting into college. Who doesn't? It's a lot of the culture, especially regarding sorority and fraternity experiences, as far as I can tell. Feel free to disagree. But the alcohol experience, that was maybe my first opening up to understanding a substance or using a substance or seeking an altered state of reality. What I remember about college is that as a student athlete, we didn't always have the time to drink. And, that's good. It kept us busy enough to where we didn't always have time to do that. However, because of the intensity and structure of the environment, the studying, the conditioning, the strength training, the practices, the games, class, what ended up happening is that when we had these punctuated moments of no practice the next day or a rest day or whatever, we tended to go really hard. And I definitely remember a few times thinking how bad I felt and how I was going to get obliterated later. And in my mind, that would make me feel better to lose control, to lose myself. So that was the beginning of my experience with substances. And then if you did listen in to the recent podcast, you may recall, or if you are a friend listening or someone that knows a little bit more about the story, you may be tapped in and hearing. And if you are one of those people, then you already know about Ben, who is the partner that I met in Florida, seeking friendship, seeking connection, going to a gym, linking up with him because he was a personal trainer, getting into his small group sessions, and eventually, after some time of being friends and being integrated into his friend group, he and I got together, and it was pretty intense in a good way until I began to observe some patterns. Now, what is important to keep in mind here is that, in the drug world at this point in my life, I was 24. I really hadn't experienced a lot. And as someone who grew up without family members that had been addicted to a substance and growing up as a person who had not used them myself, I didn't really understand what addiction meant. And that information definitely wasn't covered in class, in high school or in college. We didn't learn about the mechanisms, the physiology of addiction. We didn't learn about the behaviors of addiction. Really, all we were taught about drugs is don't do them. So that's what it is in a lot of places. And I think it's at the fault of the society's ability to approach these topics. We need to be able to approach them. And that's one of the reasons I am approaching it today, using my own experience as an example. So as I was with Ben, and we were fast friends. He was a feisty one. I think anybody who knows of his spirit can agree. And so it was easy to get into a relationship and fall in love with the guy. And early in our romantic relationship, I remember as I began to stay the night with him regularly, that he always had a beer in his hand. And if it wasn't a beer, it was a black and mild. And if it wasn't a black and mild, it was a Bang, those caffeine drinks. And this is not sponsored by them. And I have been addicted to that. And I'm so glad I'm not anymore, because that stuff is freaking poison. But in any case, I started to observe Ben's behavior and noticed that he really was using substances, as mild as they may have seemed, as innocent as I thought it all was. But I do remember noting him always having a beer. And actually, that was one of the first things that he tried to deal with when it came to Ben and addictions. He observed within himself that he was consuming alcohol, beer regularly. And so in our relationship, I remember him telling me that he began to get inspired to not drink anymore. That's not to say that we didn't sometimes, but he definitely started letting go of the can, so to speak. He didn't buy it as much. We didn't do that as much. We started playing beer pong with water, So he was making some transitions. However, if we're just going to list off the substances that Ben was addicted to, and Ben is going to have to not mind that we use him as an example. Let's list these off. Caffeine, nicotine, cannabis, alcohol. Later in our relationship, he shared with me that he had also experienced steroids. Now, here's the question of, does someone get addicted to steroids? And I would venture to say that someone who is using steroids does not become physiologically addicted to steroids. However, someone who uses steroids is at a point of insecurity to where their mental space is dependent on the substance in order to validate themselves and in order to have that puffed up physique. And we've talked about Ben before. This guy was a genetic freak. I mean, we're giving him 5'7". He's not getting more than 5'7". Ben, you were 5'7". He was 5'7", and no exaggeration, we worked out a lot together, and he would share his weight a lot, and he was a solid 230 and really not very much fat on him at all. This guy was buff, shredded, kind of striking, surprising in how he looked. And he was a physical trainer too. So he was in the gym all the time and loved it and loved being with his clients. And so to get to know him and open up into that level of him, understanding that he had used steroids for his physique, for competition, for soothing his own insecurities. And this is something that he largely did in secret, and I don't think that he told many people. But he definitely had used and abused steroids. And, this guy had also messed around with hallucinogens, mushrooms, acid. He had also messed with pain pills, cocaine. He had a lot going on when it came to the use of substances. And a lot of this I didn't really understand because of my own naivety. And it revealed itself over time, and we'll continue to talk about that so that you can understand a little bit more where I'm coming from. Why, though? Why do people become addicted to drugs? And this is an important conversation to have, one that I think schools should be having, one that I think families should be having, and one that, frankly, I think we should be talking about openly without any sort of taboo or shame around it. Because coming to grips with the reality of the effects that these drugs have on us is really important, especially when it comes to addiction. Now, I'm not someone that's at this point in my life going to tell you, say no to all drugs. And I'm not ashamed to say that either, because I have benefited from the medicinal use of certain substances in the treatment of depression and the treatment of PTSD and all of that. Okay, so I'm not here to say that it's all bad, although I am here to say that addiction itself is pretty bad news. And we could even say addiction to caffeine. Well, let's just take my own experience with caffeine. When it comes to caffeine and me, caffeine triggers migraines. And this is something I've observed in my family, and something that kept me away from caffeine for a long time because I didn't want to have migraines. I don't know if you've had migraines, but they freaking suck. They totally knock me out. I'm left unable to do anything. And so for a long time, I stayed away from caffeine. And then around the same time of getting to know Ben, getting up before sunrise to go work a conservation job out on the beach, and also working another job at a club at night to try to make it all work, I definitely began to get into the energy drinks, and I was addicted to them. And if I had too much, I'd get a migraine. If I had too little, I'd get a migraine. So I eventually had to go on a detox altogether, and I do not consume caffeine unless it's a tiny, tiny, tiny amount. But that's just to use caffeine as an example, because I know that there are so many people who are addicted to caffeine. And I might even trigger people by saying you're addicted to it, but it's true. Or ask yourself, is it true? Am I addicted to caffeine? But it's really to use the addiction model in the direction of any given substance. We can be addicted to a certain thought pattern. We can be addicted to overeating. We can be addicted to so many different things. And why is that? Why is it specifically that we use substances? And I'm talking about the hard ones too. What I have learned from Ben is that a lot of times there's a mental and emotional instability going on for whatever reasons, an inability to cope because of lack of connection or a lack of being able to speak on what is going on and wrong, and even a distrust. What I would say, as someone who has experienced PTSD, is that there's a lot to work through when it comes to that word trust, figuring out how to trust, who to trust, when to trust. And someone who has experienced PTSD and a lot of betrayal is much less likely to trust, much less likely to communicate what's going on with them because they don't trust a person enough to give them their vulnerability. And so what would someone do instead? Well, it may feel better for a moment getting onto a substance, and maybe I seek to feel better. If that makes me feel better, then I'm going to use it. And then the body becomes addicted physiologically when responding to the input of this substance. And so it can create this cycle. Not only are we getting addicted to something physiologically to where the body is becoming dependent on it, and the removal of that substance would cause a withdrawal symptom or many withdrawal symptoms, but we can also become emotionally addicted to a substance. Like, I'll use this example. We don't want to put it all on Ben. He doesn't mind that I use his name, by the way. But when it comes to substances and addiction, I've been addicted to nicotine too. And it is hard to stop. And there are a lot of tools necessary in order to successfully get off of a substance. So I would just like to state that I understand being addicted to a substance. I understand it from the personal point of view, and I understand it from the observer's point of view, observing someone who I loved being in the realm of addiction. So when we ask, why does somebody use drugs? Well, there's a much deeper issue on the internal level that would cause somebody to want or need to resort to a substance in order to have relief. And it is justifiable to want or need relief because things get difficult. Life is not always easy, and many of us have experienced a lot of times that are really difficult. So I just want to say it is understandable to seek something that makes one feel better. However, it is so important for us to be able to have enough information about the situation to not fall into the trap that is addiction, especially when it comes to the really hard substances. So as I got to know Ben, I began to awaken when it came to the world of drugs and the world of addiction just by observing him and going through my own caffeine detox. Which, by the way, when I did that, I yawned for a month straight. I'm not lying. I yawned all day long, and it happened for a month. Okay, so there are repercussions. There are consequences, whichever direction you go in. If you're getting into it, or if you're getting out of it. If you have gone so far, you must go far again. As far as you can to mend the transgressions between women and men, but most of all yourself. That's a piece from a poem I wrote. So here's the thing. And as Ben and I continued to fall in love, and as he let go of alcohol, as I observed his behavior with the other drugs that kind of slowly crept up one by one, I didn't know at first that he had done the steroids. I didn't know at first that he would willingly take pharmaceutical pain pills. I didn't know at first that the guy would do cocaine. I didn't know at first that he would do acid or any of that. And so experiencing life with him while I was in love with him began to open my eyes as I also and there's a lot of gray area in this space. I, again, have benefited from the medical cannabis legally. And I am a proponent an advocate for using it. And I think that it does and can play a significant role in the awakening process as we explore other ways of thinking. But, we got to find a line somewhere. And Ben had crossed all of them. He had crossed all the lines. I remember being in the gym with him, and while we were in the gym, this guy approached him, making small talk, asking about workouts. And when the guy walked away, Ben turned to me and he said, "That was a DEA agent." I was like, "What?" He was like, "Yeah, that was a DEA agent, and he's coming to check me out to make sure I'm clean." Now, this opens a whole other aspect of his story because in his life, years prior to us meeting, Ben later would confess to me that he had been involved in selling drugs on a large scale. And so this DEA agent was following up and observing Ben to make sure everything was kosher. And so, even at that point, I was like thinking, well, that's strange. That's odd. I still really didn't understand the gravity of Ben's relationship with drugs. And I already loved the guy. So, he could have told me a lot of different things, and I still would have been there with him by his side, loving him regardless. And that definitely affected our our interactions and my response to him sharing this information with me, that he had sold drugs. If I had known that getting into it, I probably wouldn't have been with him, but I didn't. And I don't regret being with him. However, this part right here, the part about mental and emotional health and PTSD and how addiction and drugs are linked to all that. If somebody has poor mental health, more likely to be addicted to drugs. And I'm talking about pharmaceuticals too. Don't you think I'm not? If somebody has poor mental health, poor emotional health, if they're not feeling connected into a community, they are much more likely to have an addiction problem. And if someone is suffering from PTSD, whether they played a role, well, we all play a role in the manifestation of our life, but I'm talking about whether they were the harmer or the receiver of the trauma, a person will get PTSD anyways. And, we're going deep here, and I don't mean to freak anybody out, but listen, if someone is hurting others, killing others, or doing anything like that, that person will suffer, because seeing something like that happen and being the one that made it happen, that will never leave. You'll never be able to forget that. That will be scripted into your spirit for lifetimes. And also, if you are on the receiving end, it's hard to forget the things that traumatize us. And we probably never will. There are a lot of lessons in that, like I have talked about learning lessons from my trauma to transmute the experiences into gold and not be a victim of them. But what is really important to know here is that, one, someone who does the harm will receive PTSD. And two, what is PTSD? PTSD, post-traumatic stress. This experience is mental, emotional, physical, spiritual. It affects us socially. It is real. PTSD symptoms can include and are not limited to having cold sweats, nightmares, inability to sleep, inability to participate in certain social situations, getting quote unquote randomly triggered until we identify what our triggers are and can understand why we are responding in different ways, reacting in different ways. And I remember being with Ben and him having problems sleeping. I mean, the guy would lay in bed and then get up after I fell asleep to go do what he did. And really avoided sleep at all costs because he could not, his heart almost couldn't bear to go into the sleep state where his subconscious would reveal to him the acts that he had experienced, which caused the PTSD. I mean, sometimes he would fall asleep and I would wake up because I'd be drenched in his cold sweat. The guy would have cold sweats. He would be having nightmares I would wake him from. And this is related to his experience in the drug realm. Ben had nightmares because of selling drugs and the life experiences that came along with that. And that is for him to deal with. And one of the reasons I would never recommend selling drugs. Okay? Because there are consequences like what I'm telling you now, with experiences that keep one up at night, experiences that prevent one from being able to sleep or to want to sleep. And I can't even dip into all of the science about the need for sleep and how lack of sleep affects us psychologically, let alone physically. We really need sleep. And so to be someone who has trauma and not be able to fall asleep, that is a downward spiral right there. I remember trying to wake him up out of his nightmares, and the guy was suffering because of those experiences. And so with PTSD and with the stigma around mental health that still exists, what was he going to do? What was he going to do? Go to the psychiatrist he couldn't afford and talk about how he had sold drugs on a massive scale and how he had experienced people dying, people getting murdered? Do you think he was going to come out and tell anybody that? No. But that's a reality that he had to suffer through, the consequences of his actions and his participation in that realm. Meanwhile, we're talking about mental and emotional health. I had just gotten out of being in the realm of eating disorder. I had my own mental and emotional health things going on. I'd probably been a year, maybe a year and a half, maybe 2 years out of throwing up and restraining food for myself. So I was still in the baby stages of revitalizing my mental and emotional health state. And I really hadn't thought about mental health or emotional health until further down the journey with Ben. So this episode is really to illuminate that there are reasons for addiction that are valid. It's understandable to want to use a substance, and there are consequences. So it is wise to explore alternatives, alternative coping mechanisms like what I talked about in season 1, which is meditation, alternative coping mechanisms like creating art. There's science behind creating art and how the release of that energy from our bodies through our hands helps one to come into a better emotional and mental state. There are alternatives like talking to people, building trusting, loving relationships so that we can feel safe enough to talk about what is going on with us. There are alternatives, and it is important. And this is something that I had to go through. It is important to select people. If we're going to be out there in the social world, we need to be able to pick people who are good for us so that we don't fall down the same rabbit holes as they did. There's a whole conversation about boundaries. There's a whole conversation about self-love and what it means to protect oneself, what it means to be aware of others' behaviors that, in my frame are addiction related. I need to be able to identify people who have problems with addiction. And I need to be able to identify addiction within my own self and resolve that, because I know where that road leads. I've seen it. And it was a whole awakening process that continues in the next episode. So thank you for listening. I appreciate you receiving this information, these stories. You can check out Light Diamond Creative on Instagram, YouTube. If the information serves you and you want to contribute to the continuing release of this free information, feel free to send a donation to Light Diamond Creative on Venmo or Cash App. This is really for a shared experience. I know I'm not the only one. I know there are many of us who have either suffered from addiction ourselves or have witnessed someone we love suffer from addiction and not make it. Or make it. That's a much better story. All right. So thanks for listening. Thanks for tuning in. I'll see you all, hear you all, be with you all in the next episode. Peace.